On this serene Christmas Eve, as snow blankets the world in quiet magic, let yourself sink into a story of expectancy, transformation, and wonder. Let the gentle rhythm of this tale carry you to a place where the simplest moments reveal life's greatest treasures. The snow fell in soft whispers, blanketing the world in a serene stillness. The streets were quiet, their usual hum replaced by the occasional crunch of footsteps and the faint sound of bells from a distant clock tower. It was Christmas Eve, a night brimming with promise, though not everyone paused to notice. For Claire Bennett, the night was just another in her tightly wound schedule. She was a woman of stature, her days measured in meetings and her nights lost to the glow of screens and figures. While the world outside slowed to celebrate the season, Claire pressed on, her focus unyielding. But as the hours grew later and the roads grew emptier, life began to shift in ways she could never have anticipated. Her car hummed along the edge of town, its heated leather seats keeping the chill at bay. Outside, the city's glittering lights faded into darker, quieter streets. The polished glass skyscrapers gave way to modest brick buildings, their charm softened by wreaths hung in windows and strings of lights adorning doorways. Claire barely noticed the transition, her gaze fixed on her phone as she scrolled through endless emails. The warm glow of Christmas lights flickered past her window, unregistered in the blur of work and thought. But then, the world seemed to hold its breath. A soft jolt rattled the car, and Claire glanced up, her sharp eyes narrowing. The vehicle stuttered, then rolled to a halt. The engine's hum disappeared, leaving only the faint hiss of snowflakes brushing against the glass. "What now?" she murmured, her tone clipped but quiet in the stillness. The driver, an older man with a kind face and steady demeanor, stepped out into the snow, his boots crunching softly as he circled to inspect the engine. Claire watched him through the window, irritation rising as she wrapped her coat tighter around herself. The minutes passed slowly, the cold seeping into the car despite its luxurious insulation. Claire finally stepped out, her heels sinking slightly into the snowy street. The sharp air stung her cheeks, and for the first time in days, she felt the bite of winter. "It's the engine, Miss Bennett," the driver said apologetically. His voice was calm, but carried a hint of worry. "We'll need a tow. It may take some time." Claire sighed, her breath visible in the icy air. The soft glow of a street lamp illuminated the deserted street ahead, the faint hum of life from the distant city barely audible. She crossed her arms, her irritation giving way to unease. The quiet was unnerving, a stark contrast to the constant buzz of her usual life. Here, away from the safety of her world, the silence felt vast, almost alive. As she stood there, the snow continued to fall, delicate and unhurried. Each flake seemed to carry with it a gentle reminder of the world's slower rhythms, a rhythm she had long forgotten. The driver offered to wait by the car while Claire paced nearby, her boots tapping softly against the snow-dusted asphalt. She glanced down the street, her eyes lingering on the faint outline of an old, weathered building at the corner. Its windows glowed faintly, a single flickering light casting shadows on the frost-covered walls. For reasons she couldn't quite explain, Claire felt drawn to it. Perhaps it was the stillness of the scene or the way the snow seemed to settle more thickly there, muffling the edges of the world. "Stay here," she said softly to the driver, her voice losing some of its sharpness. She began walking toward the light, her steps slow and deliberate. The snow crunched lightly beneath her heels, and the sound, though faint, was comforting in its simplicity. The building loomed closer, its faded brick walls bearing the marks of years gone by. The front door was slightly ajar, a thin stream of warmth escaping into the frosty air. Claire hesitated, her hand brushing the wooden frame before stepping inside. The warmth inside was immediate, wrapping around her like an old familiar coat. The room was small and sparsely furnished, its only light coming from a modest fire burning in a metal can in the corner. A man sat nearby, his figure relaxed and still. He wore layers of worn clothing, and his hands rested on his lap, palms open as if welcoming the heat of the flames. His face was turned toward the fire, the soft orange light highlighting the lines of his features. Claire watched him silently, the flickering light casting gentle shadows across the room. For a moment, the world outside seemed to fade. The snow and the night held at bay by the quiet warmth of this simple space. The faint glow of the candle softened the edges of the dimly lit room, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Claire sat stiffly on an old wooden crate, her fur-lined coat draped over her shoulders like armor. The air was warmer here, but not entirely comfortable. The quiet hum of the wind outside filled the space, a reminder of the icy world beyond. Lucas moved with calm efficiency, his boots brushing softly against the floor as he rummaged through a worn bag in the corner. Gerald stood by the door, his eyes scanning the room, as though waiting for reassurance that they weren't in any danger. Claire watched Lucas closely, her gaze tracing his every movement, trying to decipher the man who seemed so at ease in such meager surroundings. Lucas finally broke the silence, setting a small pot atop a metal grate positioned over the candle's flame. "Tea might take a while," he said casually, his voice low and steady. "This setup isn't exactly state-of-the-art." Claire raised an eyebrow, her lips pressed into a tight line. The scent of faintly burning wax and something metallic filled the room. She crossed her legs, the sharp click of her heel against the floor cutting through the quiet. "You seem prepared for this," she said, her tone tinged with skepticism. Lucas glanced at her, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You learn to adapt," he said simply, stirring whatever liquid was heating in the pot. "Cold nights like this, you have to." Claire didn't respond. Instead, her gaze drifted to the modest surroundings. A thin mattress tucked neatly in one corner, its blanket frayed at the edges. The crate serving as a makeshift table. A stack of books, their spines faded and worn, leaning against the wall. This was a world she had never known, a life stripped of luxury and polished surfaces. She couldn't imagine calling a place like this home. The minutes stretched on, the crackle of the candle and the occasional rustle of fabric the only sounds between them. Gerald remained by the door, standing protectively but saying nothing. Lucas sat cross-legged on the floor, sipping a steaming cup of tea from a chipped mug. His calm demeanor only deepened Claire's unease. Her gaze shifted to a small frame perched precariously on the crate. Inside it was a photograph of a smiling young boy holding a fishing pole, his grin wide and carefree. She frowned slightly, her curiosity briefly eclipsing her discomfort. "Who's the boy?" she asked, her voice breaking the silence. Lucas followed her gaze and hesitated for a moment before answering. "My son," he said softly, his words carrying a weight that hung in the air. "He'd be about 12 now." Claire's brow furrowed. "Where is he?" Lucas stared into his mug, the candlelight reflecting in his eyes. "With his mother," he said after a pause. "They're better off without me." The quiet that followed felt heavier than before. Claire shifted in her seat, suddenly unsure of what to say. The mention of family stirred something deep within her, a pang of memory she wasn't prepared for, but she quickly pushed it aside, unwilling to dwell on things she had long since buried. Outside, the wind howled again, rattling the boards on the windows. The snow had thickened, its soft fall transforming into a swirling dance under the street lamp's faint glow. Lucas stood and reached for another blanket, handing it to Gerald, who accepted it with a nod of gratitude. He then retrieved a second blanket and handed it to Claire. "You'll need this," he said matter-of-factly. "It gets colder before it gets warmer." Claire hesitated before taking it, the rough fabric unfamiliar against her manicured fingers. "Thanks," she muttered, barely audible. Lucas returned to his seat, his movements unhurried and deliberate. The candle between them flickered, its light creating an almost hypnotic rhythm. Claire leaned back slightly, her posture relaxing against her will. The warmth of the room and the soft crackle of the flame began to chip away at the sharp edges of her thoughts. As time passed, Claire found herself observing Lucas more closely. His weathered hands moved steadily, his every action deliberate and measured. There was a quiet strength about him, a resilience that seemed at odds with his surroundings. She wondered how someone could live like this, so far removed from everything she considered essential. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked suddenly, surprising herself with the question. Lucas looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Leaving where?" "This," she said, gesturing vaguely to the room around them. "This life." He tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "It's not about where you live, Miss Bennett," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It's about what you carry with you. You could be in the tallest penthouse or the smallest shelter. It doesn't change what's inside." Claire bristled slightly, her instinctive defense rising. "That's easy to say when you don't have a choice." Lucas chuckled softly, his breath visible in the candle's glow. "You'd be surprised how many choices we all have. Some just look different than others." The room fell silent again, but Claire's mind churned. She thought about her sprawling penthouse, its sleek lines and polished surfaces. It was everything she had worked for, a testament to her ambition and drive. And yet, sitting here in this tiny room, wrapped in a blanket she would have scoffed at just hours ago, she felt something unfamiliar, a strange, uneasy hollowness. The night deepened, the snow outside forming a thick blanket over the streets. Lucas added another candle to the makeshift table, its warm light pushing back the shadows that lingered in the corners. Gerald, who had been quietly leaning against the wall, finally spoke. "The tow truck should be here in about an hour," he said, his voice steady but weary. Claire nodded, relief mingling with a strange reluctance. An hour. Soon she would be back in her world, back to the routine that had consumed her life. Yet the thought didn't bring the comfort she expected. She glanced at Lucas, who was quietly folding one of the blankets. He moved as though time didn't press against him, as though every moment held its own purpose. Claire's gaze lingered on him, a question forming in her mind but never reaching her lips. As the clock inched closer to midnight, the room grew quieter still, the soft crackle of the candle flame the only sound. Claire closed her eyes briefly, letting the warmth of the blanket and the rhythm of her breath ease the tension in her body. The unfamiliar stillness began to feel less like a void and more like a pause, a moment to simply exist. Lucas's voice, low and steady, broke the silence. "Christmas has a way of bringing things to the surface, doesn't it?" Claire opened her eyes, her gaze meeting his across the soft glow of the candle. She didn't respond, but she didn't need to. The quiet between them carried more understanding than words could. Outside, the snow fell softly again, blanketing the world in a quiet stillness. Inside, the warmth of the room wrapped around them like a fragile cocoon, holding the night's secrets just a little longer. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the faint scent of snow and pine. Claire stepped outside the small shelter, her heels sinking slightly into the soft layer of white beneath her. The cold nipped at her cheeks, sharp and invigorating, but it no longer felt oppressive. Instead, it carried a sense of clarity, as though the world had been reset in the stillness of the night. The tow truck rumbled softly a few yards away, its warm exhaust puffing into the air like lazy clouds. Gerald was already speaking with the driver, his calm demeanor a steady presence in the otherwise quiet street. Claire hesitated at the threshold of the shelter, her hand lingering on the rusted doorframe. She glanced back into the room where Lucas sat cross-legged near the fading candle. The morning light filtered through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, illuminating the humble space with a soft, golden glow. Lucas's silhouette seemed almost peaceful, as though he belonged to this quiet world, in a way Claire could never understand. She felt a strange pull, a question forming in her mind, but caught in the tangle of her thoughts. "Thank you," Claire said, her voice steady but quiet. The words felt small, insufficient for what the night had revealed to her. Lucas looked up, his gaze meeting hers with a calm warmth. "Take care, Miss Bennett," he replied simply, his tone carrying the weight of an unspoken understanding. For a moment, she considered saying more, asking about his life, his choices, or the small photograph on the crate. But something stopped her, an instinct telling her that the answers she sought couldn't be found here. Instead, she nodded once and turned away, the snow crunching softly beneath her feet as she walked toward the car. The drive back into the city was quiet. Gerald, sensing her mood, kept his usual chatter to himself. Claire stared out the window, her reflection faint against the backdrop of snow-covered streets and buildings waking to the early light. The city skyline loomed closer with each passing mile, its polished surfaces and sharp lines a stark contrast to the soft edges of the world she had just left. Her thoughts swirled, fragments of the night replaying in her mind, the flicker of the candlelight, the quiet strength in Lucas's voice, the photograph of his son. She thought of his words, how choices could weigh you down, how regret didn't change the past. For years, she had dismissed those ideas, wrapping herself in the armor of success and independence. But now, for reasons she couldn't quite name, those words lingered. By the time they reached her penthouse, the city was fully awake. The streets below bustled with the movement of cars and people, their hurried steps a reminder of the world Claire had built her life around. She stepped out of the car, her polished heels clicking against the marble pavement as she entered the sleek lobby. The warmth of the building wrapped around her, but it felt different now, less comforting, more hollow. Her penthouse was exactly as she had left it, pristine, minimalist, and perfectly arranged. The silence pressed against her, heavy and unyielding. Claire set her bag on the counter and walked towards the floor-to-ceiling windows, where the city stretched out before her. From here, the world seemed distant, like a painting she could admire, but not touch. On the sleek glass coffee table sat a forgotten reminder of the night before, the small, frayed doll the little girl had given her. Its worn dress and stitched eyes stood in quiet contrast to the polished surfaces around it. Claire stared at the doll for a long moment, her thoughts drifting back to the warmth of Lucas's shelter and the laughter of the children who had nothing but each other. Hours passed, though Claire barely noticed. She moved through her day like a ghost, her usual routine feeling strange and out of place. The sharp efficiency that had defined her life now felt like a mask she could no longer wear. Emails went unanswered, calls ignored. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to pause. By evening, the city outside glowed with the soft warmth of Christmas lights. The streets below were alive with people carrying wrapped packages, children bundled in scarves and mittens, and carolers singing beneath lampposts. Claire watched them from her window, her hand resting lightly against the glass. It was a world she had long avoided, a world she suddenly felt drawn to. Without fully understanding why, Claire found herself searching for the address of the shelter Lucas had mentioned the night before. The search took only a moment, the result popping up on her screen like an invitation. She hesitated, her finger hovering over the map before closing her laptop and grabbing her coat. The drive to the shelter was quiet. This time, Claire sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Gerald glanced at her once, his expression curious but respectful. He didn't ask where they were going, and she didn't offer an explanation. The shelter was nestled between two old buildings, its exterior unassuming but warm. Strings of lights framed the windows, casting a soft glow onto the snow-covered sidewalk. Claire stepped inside, the scent of bread and soup greeting her like an old friend. The room was filled with people, volunteers moving between long tables, children laughing as they played with makeshift toys, and families sharing simple meals. Claire stood near the door, her eyes scanning the room. The warmth and noise felt overwhelming at first, a stark contrast to the quiet stillness of her penthouse. But as she watched, something softened within her. This was a world she didn't know, yet it felt strangely familiar. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes approached her, a welcoming smile on her face. "Welcome," the woman said. "Are you here to volunteer?" Claire hesitated, the question catching her off guard. "I'm just looking for someone," she said finally. The woman nodded, her expression understanding. "Well, you're welcome to stay as long as you like. There's plenty to do if you feel like lending a hand." Claire offered a small smile, her usual sharpness softened by the warmth of the woman's tone. She moved further into the room, her eyes searching for a familiar face. Children ran past her, their laughter echoing in the high ceilings. Volunteers handed out cups of hot cocoa, their hands quick but gentle. It was a far cry from the polished efficiency of her office, but it was real. It was alive. Finally, Claire spotted him. Lucas was seated near the corner, his silhouette unmistakable. He was talking to a young boy, his voice low and calm, his hands gesturing as he explained something. The boy laughed, his smile wide and unguarded, before running off to join the other children. Claire approached slowly, her heels muffled by the worn carpet. Lucas glanced up as she neared, his expression shifting from surprise to quiet amusement. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice carrying the same steady warmth as the night before. "Didn't expect to see you here." Claire hesitated, her hands brushing the edges of her coat. "I wasn't sure if I'd find you," she admitted, "but I needed to come." Lucas nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "And what brought you back?" Claire glanced around the room, her eyes lingering on the children playing near the Christmas tree, the volunteers laughing as they worked, and the small, frayed decorations strung along the walls. "I wanted to understand," she said softly, "why you stay here, how you find peace." Lucas leaned back slightly, his expression calm. "It's not about peace," he said. "It's about purpose, about seeing what really matters." Claire's chest tightened at the words, the weight of their meaning settling over her like the first snowfall of winter. She looked at Lucas, the man who had shown her a world she had never thought to see, and for the first time she felt the stirrings of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The air inside the shelter carried the warmth of shared laughter and quiet conversations. Claire sat across from Lucas at a small table near the corner of the room. Around them, the hum of activity continued. Volunteers offering meals, children playing with paper ornaments, and families bundled in donated blankets. It was a world that moved at its own pace, far removed from the fast, calculated rhythm of Claire's life. Lucas leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful but calm. "You seem different," he said, his tone as steady as ever, quieter than last night. Claire let out a faint laugh, her gaze drifting to the small Christmas tree at the center of the room. It was decorated with scraps of ribbon, paper stars, and strings of popcorn. The lights blinked unevenly, but it didn't matter. It was beautiful in its own way. "Last night felt like an interruption," Claire admitted. "Something I needed to get through so I could move on. But now, I'm not so sure." Lucas tilted his head, studying her with quiet curiosity. "What changed?" She hesitated, her fingers brushing the edge of the table. The question was simple, but the answer felt impossibly large. "I don't know," she said softly. "I guess I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time. Something real." Lucas nodded, as though her answer made perfect sense. Real is hard to ignore once you've seen it. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the noise of the shelter filling the space between them. Claire's gaze shifted to a young boy playing near the Christmas tree. He held a makeshift toy, a car crafted from cardboard and bottle caps, and rolled it across the floor with a wide grin. The The simplicity of his joy stirred something in her, a memory she couldn't quite grasp. "Do you ever wish things were different?" she asked suddenly, her voice quiet but steady. "That you could go back and change what happened?" Lucas looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Of course," he said, "but wishing doesn't change anything. It's what you do with what's left that matters." The words settled over her like a gentle snowfall, quiet but profound. She thought of the choices she had made, the long hours, the sacrifices, the walls she had built around herself. For years, she had told herself it was all worth it, that success justified everything she had left behind. But now, sitting in this room, surrounded by people who had so little yet seemed so full, she wasn't so sure. The evening stretched on, the light outside fading into the soft glow of Christmas Eve. Volunteers began passing out small gifts, bundled socks, handmade scarves, and tiny trinkets wrapped in tissue paper. Claire watched as children tore into their packages with wide-eyed excitement, their laughter filling the room. One little girl approached her, holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. She was no older than 6, her dark curls bouncing as she handed the gift to Claire with a shy smile. "Merry Christmas," the girl said, her voice barely above a whisper. Claire took the package, her fingers brushing against the rough paper. "Thank you," she said, her voice catching slightly. The girl beamed and ran off, leaving Claire holding the simple gift. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small ornament made of twigs and string. It was uneven and fragile, but it was beautiful. Claire held it in her hands, her chest tightening as a wave of unexpected emotion washed over her. Lucas watched her quietly, his gaze soft. "Funny how the smallest things can mean the most," he said. Claire nodded, her throat tightening. She placed the ornament on the table, her fingers lingering on the delicate string. "I don't know how you do it," she said, her voice low. "Living like this, finding meaning in all of it." Lucas leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the edge of the table. "It's not about what you have," he said. "It's about what you give. That's where the meaning is." The simplicity of his words left her speechless. She thought of the years she had spent chasing success, the wealth she had accumulated, the empty spaces that filled her life, and for the first time, she wondered if she had been looking in the wrong places all along. As the evening came to a close, the shelter began to quiet. Families bundled their children in coats, volunteers cleaned tables, and the hum of activity softened into a peaceful stillness. Claire stood near the door, the small ornament tucked safely in her coat pocket. Lucas stood beside her, his presence calm and steady. "Will you come back?" he asked, his tone gentle but curious. She hesitated, her gaze drifting to the glowing tree in the center of the room. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think I want to." Lucas nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. That's a start. When Claire returned to her penthouse that night, the city below her sparkled with the soft glow of Christmas lights. The silence of her home felt different now, not empty, but full of possibility. She placed the twig ornament on her coffee table beside the frayed doll from the night before. Together, they stood as quiet reminders of a world she had only just begun to see. The next morning, Christmas dawned softly, the sunlight filtering through the large windows of her home. Claire found herself reaching for her phone, but not to check emails or calendar notifications. Instead, she scrolled through a list of local shelters, her fingers pausing over one name in particular, the place Lucas had shown her. Without overthinking, she dialed the number. A cheerful voice answered, and Claire found herself asking a question she never thought she would. "Do you need any extra hands today?" The day passed quickly, filled with the quiet hum of work and the soft glow of connection. Claire spent hours wrapping gifts, serving meals, and listening to the stories of those around her. By the time the sun began to set, her heart felt lighter, her steps less hurried. As she stepped outside the shelter, the cold air greeted her like an old friend. Lucas stood nearby, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. He nodded toward her, his expression calm but warm. "Looks like you found your way back." Claire smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. "Maybe I did." The days that followed marked the beginning of something new. Claire returned to the shelter often, her carefully guarded walls crumbling with each visit. She began to understand what Lucas had meant, that the meaning of life wasn't in what you had, but in what you gave. And for the first time, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose. On New Year's Eve, Claire stood outside the shelter with Lucas, watching the first snow of the year drift lazily to the ground. She turned to him, her voice steady but filled with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," she said, "for showing me this." Lucas smiled, his breath visible in the cold air. "You didn't need me to show you. You just needed to look." As the clock struck midnight, Claire felt a warmth she couldn't explain, a quiet joy that came not from what she had, but from what she had found. And for the first time, she welcomed the year ahead, not as a race to the top, but as a chance to truly live. As the snow continued to fall gently across the city, Claire realized her life had shifted, like the soft turning of a page. The once hollow pursuit of success was now replaced with a quiet sense of connection and purpose. She had rediscovered the joy in giving, the warmth in human connection, and the meaning she had been searching for all along. This Christmas taught her something profound. True wealth isn't found in what you accumulate, but in what you share. Claire's journey from a cold, isolated millionaire to a compassionate and family-oriented woman reminds us of the importance of connection, forgiveness, and giving back. Her story is a powerful example of how life's unexpected turns can lead to personal growth and meaningful change. If this story brought you comfort, take a moment to reflect on the connections in your own life, share kindness, give freely, and let this holiday season remind you of what truly matters. Don't forget to subscribe for more soothing stories that help you unwind and drift peacefully into relaxation.